The midday sun beat down on Oak Ridge City like an open furnace. It was the kind of August heat that made the air shimmer above the pavement and had most folks seeking shelter in air-conditioned buildings. But not everyone had that luxury. In the West Side neighborhood, many of the older homes lacked modern cooling systems, forcing residents to find creative ways to beat the heat. Officer James Wilder wiped sweat from his forehead as he drove his patrol car slowly down Maple Street. He'd been with the Oak Ridge Police Department for 12 years now, and he didn't try to hide his frustration at being assigned to patrol this part of town. Wilder had a reputation among his fellow officers. They knew to laugh at his jokes when he made them, even the ones that crossed lines. They knew he had a quick temper that flared hot and burned out just as fast, and they knew he somehow always managed to avoid getting into serious trouble. "It's who you know," Officer Rodriguez had once whispered to a rookie who asked how Wilder had dodged a complaint. His uncle was deputy chief back in the day. Today, Wilder was in a particularly sour mood. The air conditioning in his patrol car was working at half strength. His lunch order had been wrong, and now he was sweating through his uniform in a neighborhood he didn't want to be in. His eyes narrowed as he spotted an elderly black woman sitting in a folding chair near the sidewalk in front of a small blue house with white trim. Mrs. Edith Johnson, 78 years old with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, fanned herself with a church bulletin. She had placed her chair just at the edge of her small front yard, hoping to catch whatever breeze might come along. The big oak tree that once provided shade had been damaged in last year's storm and had to be cut down. Now, the front of her house caught the full strength of the sun all afternoon. She'd lived in that same house for over 40 years, raised her children there, and now sometimes watched her great-grandchildren when they visited. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Mrs. Johnson. She was the one who organized the community garden, who still baked pies for new families that moved in, and who kept an eye on the neighborhood children as they played. Officer Wilder pulled his car to a stop and got out, adjusting his belt as he approached Mrs. Johnson. "Ma'am, you can't have this chair blocking the walkway," he called out, even though the chair was clearly on the grass, not obstructing anyone's path. Mrs. Johnson looked up, squinting against the sun behind the officer. "Good afternoon, officer," she said politely. "I'm just trying to catch a bit of breeze. It's mighty hot today." "That doesn't matter." "You're creating an obstruction," Wilder insisted, his voice carrying down the quiet street. A couple of neighbors sitting on porches nearby looked over with concern. "I'm sorry if it seems that way," Mrs. Johnson replied, her voice steady and dignified despite the growing tension. "But I'm on my property and the chair isn't on the sidewalk. If anyone needs to pass by, I'd be happy to move it temporarily." Wilder stepped closer, towering over the seated woman. "Look, I don't have time to argue with you. Move the chair back to your porch now." Mrs. Johnson took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly around her paper fan. She had lived through too much in her lifetime to be intimidated easily. "May I ask your name and badge number, please, officer? I'd like to understand why this is a problem today when I've been sitting here all summer." Something in her calm question seemed to trigger Wilder. His face flushed deeper than the heat could explain. "You want my badge number?" he said, his voice rising. "You think you're going to file a complaint against me for doing my job?" Across the street, Thomas Lee, a high school student home for summer break, had been washing his mom's car. He slowly put down the sponge and pulled out his phone, noticing how the officer's body language had changed. Thomas had been part of a youth leadership program that taught teenagers about their rights and community relations. Something told him he should document what was happening. Mrs. Johnson remained composed. "I simply asked for your identification, which I believe is my right as a citizen." Wilder unclipped the water bottle from his belt. It was a large one, still half full of ice water he'd filled at the station before starting his shift. "You know." "What? You said you were hot, right?" His voice had taken on a mocking tone that made several onlookers step closer. "Let me help you cool down." Before anyone could react, Officer Wilder unscrewed the cap and upended the bottle over Mrs. Johnson's head. The ice-cold water poured down her face, soaking her carefully styled hair in the front of her light blue dress. Droplets clung to her glasses as she gasped in shock. "There," Wilder said with a smirk. "Now you're cooled off." And here's my badge. Number. He tapped the badge on his chest. Feel free to complain. Mrs. Johnson sat perfectly still, water dripping from her chin onto her lap. The paper fan in her hand had dissolved into a soggy mess. But despite the humiliation, she didn't cry out or lose her composure. Instead, she looked directly at Wilder, with eyes that had witnessed decades of both progress and painful reminders that some things hadn't changed enough. "Young man," she said finally, her voice soft but carrying in the stunned silence of the street, "I pray someone shows you more kindness than you've shown me today." Thomas's hand trembled slightly as he recorded everything. 2 houses down, Mrs. Washington, another elderly neighbor, had already gone inside to make a phone call. She knew someone who worked directly with the police chief, and she wasn't about to let this incident slide. Wilder seemed momentarily taken aback by Mrs. Johnson's response. He had expected anger, tears, or submission, not this quiet dignity that somehow made him feel smaller despite his uniform and authority. Recovering quickly, he pulled out his citation book. "I'm writing you up for obstruction and for interfering with an officer," he said, pen scratching aggressively against paper. "Maybe that will teach you to respect the law." What Officer Wilder didn't know was that his actions had set in motion events that would soon change everything. For himself, for Mrs. Johnson, and for the entire Oak Ridge Police Department. And it would all begin with the arrival of a black SUV that was, at that very moment, turning onto Maple Street. Thomas Lees. Hands trembled slightly as he continued recording. He was 17, tall for his age, but with a quiet nature that made him prefer observing to being the center of attention. His summer had been divided between helping at his mom's small bakery and working on a community relations project for his high school leadership program. The project had seemed important but abstract until now. Suddenly, it was unfolding in real time right before his eyes. Across the street, Mrs. Johnson sat drenched and dignified while Officer Wilder scribbled aggressively in his citation book. The contrast between them struck Thomas deeply. The elderly woman maintaining her composure despite the water dripping from her silver hair, and the uniformed officer whose power should have made him the bigger person, but whose actions had done the opposite. "You'll receive this citation in the mail," Wilder said, tearing the paper from his book with unnecessary force. "Next time, keep your chair on your porch where it belongs." Mrs. Johnson didn't answer. She simply looked at him with eyes that had seen too much in her lifetime to be truly surprised by cruelty, yet never became hardened to it. This quiet dignity seemed to unnerve Wilder more than any angry response would have. The street had grown unusually still. Neighbors watched from porches and windows, their faces showing mixtures of shock, anger, and a weariness that came from seeing variations of this scene too many times before. Mr. Rivera, from 2 doors down, had stepped off his porch and was walking slowly toward Mrs. Johnson's yard, his face set in determination. "Hey, get back on your property!" Wilder barked at him, one hand moving to rest on his belt near his taser. Thomas zoomed in with his phone camera to make sure everything was clearly visible. His heart pounded as he realized how quickly the situation could escalate further. On the other side of the street, he noticed Mrs. Washington, an elementary school principal who'd retired 3 years ago, speaking urgently into her phone while watching through her screen door. What nobody yet knew was that Mrs. Washington wasn't calling 911. She was calling her nephew Anthony, who worked as an administrative assistant in the police chief's office. Anthony had given his aunt his direct number for emergencies, never imagining she'd need to use it for something like this. "It's happening right now, Anthony," Mrs. Washington said, her normally calm voice tight with urgency. "On Maple Street in front of Edith Johnson's house. That officer, the one with the complaints, he just poured water all over her head. She's soaking wet, sitting there in the heat. The boy across the street is recording it. You need to tell the chief right away." Anthony didn't waste time asking questions. Chief Robert Jackson had built his reputation on community accountability and transparency. He'd been fighting an uphill battle to change the department's culture since taking over the position 2 years ago. Anthony knew the chief would want to know about this immediately, especially since he was currently in a meeting just a few blocks away. Back on Maple Street, Mrs. Johnson slowly rose from her chair, her wet dress clinging uncomfortably to her thin frame. "I'm going inside now, officer," she said quietly. "Unless you intend to prevent me from entering my own home." Wilder gestured dismissively toward her house. "Go ahead. Just remember what I said about keeping your stuff off the public walkway." As Mrs. Johnson carefully made her way up the 3 steps to her porch, several neighbors moved toward her house, clearly intending to check on her once the officer left. Thomas could hear his own mother's voice in his head. "If you see something wrong happening, document it, then share it with people who can help." The leadership program instructor had said something similar. Your phone can be a tool for accountability. Making a quick decision, Thomas texted the video to his older cousin Daniel, who worked at City Hall. He didn't have time to explain everything. He just wrote, "Officer poured water on Mrs. Johnson. Maple Street. Happening now. Very bad. Share with anyone who can help." Daniel was in a meeting when the text came through, but he glanced at his phone out of habit. When he saw the first few seconds of the video, he immediately excused himself and stepped into the hallway to watch the full clip. Daniel had grown up on Maple Street. He knew Mrs. Johnson. She had babysat him when he was a kid. Seeing her, sitting there drenched, made something clench in his chest. His desk was just 2 floors below the office of Councilwoman Patricia Chen, who headed the Public Safety Committee. Daniel had helped the councilwoman's assistant with a computer problem last month, and she had told him to come directly to her if he ever needed anything. This definitely qualified. Within minutes, the video had been shared with Councilwoman Chen, who immediately called Police Chief Jackson. By pure coincidence, the chief was less than 5 minutes away, attending a community planning meeting at the West Side Community Center. Officer Wilder, completely unaware of the rapidly spreading video and the approaching consequences, had returned to his patrol car. He was filling out the rest of his report, already mentally minimizing what had happened. In his version, the old woman had been argumentative and disrespectful. He had simply used water from his personal bottle to diffuse a tense situation on a hot day. Anyone watching the body cam footage, which he conveniently hadn't activated until after the water incident, would see a calm officer dealing professionally with an uncooperative citizen. He was so busy constructing this narrative in his mind that he didn't immediately notice the black SUV with police department markings that turned onto Maple Street. He also didn't notice how the neighbors, instead of dispersing now that he was back in his car, seemed to be waiting for something. Their attention split between Mrs. Johnson's house, where several women had gone inside to help her, and the approaching vehicle. Thomas, however, was still recording. When he recognized the SUV as belonging to senior department leadership, he shifted position to capture whatever was about to happen. His project on community police relations was about to get a lot more interesting than he had ever anticipated. Inside the SUV, Chief Robert Jackson reviewed the video on his phone one more time before instructing his driver to pull up directly behind Officer Wilder's patrol car. The chief was a tall man with close-cropped gray hair and the measured movements of someone who had spent decades in law enforcement. He had built his career on principles of respect and accountability, and what he had just witnessed violated everything he stood for. "Park right here," he instructed his driver, his deep voice calm despite the anger he felt building inside. "Let's not give Officer Wilder any chance to leave before we have our conversation." Officer Wilder was halfway through typing his report when movement in his rearview mirror caught his attention. A black SUV had parked directly behind his patrol car, effectively blocking him in. The vehicle wasn't just any department SUV, it had the gold stripe that marked it as belonging to the command staff. Wilder's fingers froze above his keyboard as he watched the driver's door open. When Chief Robert Jackson stepped out, Wilder felt a cold sensation that had nothing to do with the air conditioning finally kicking in at full blast. In his 12 years on the force, he had managed to keep his direct interactions with the chief to a minimum. He'd heard other officers complain about Jackson's by-the-book approach and his focus on what they dismissively called community feelings. Wilder had always been careful to put on his professional face during the rare department-wide meetings where the chief was present. But this the chief showing up personally during a routine patrol. This had never happened before. Wilder quickly closed his laptop and stepped out of his car, straightening his uniform and putting on what he hoped was a neutral, professional expression. "Chief Jackson," he said, his voice coming out slightly higher than normal. "I wasn't expecting you, sir." The chief didn't immediately respond. His eyes swept the scene. The neighbors gathered on porches and sidewalks, Thomas still recording. From across the street, and several women now coming out of Mrs. Johnson's house. One carried a towel, another a change of clothes. The evidence of what had happened was clear even without the video he'd watched on his phone. "Officer Wilder," the chief finally said, his voice carefully controlled, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened here." Wilder shifted his weight, unconsciously settling into the stance he used when constructing a story he wanted believed. "Just a minor situation with a resident obstructing the public walkway, sir. I addressed it and was just completing the paperwork." Bidol. Chief's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. "And Mrs. Johnson's current state? Why is she wet?" A bead of sweat formed at Wilder's hairline that had nothing to do with the heat. "Well, sir, it's quite hot today. She mentioned being uncomfortable in the heat, so I offered some water to help cool her down." From across the street, Thomas Lee couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see the chief's posture stiffen. Several neighbors had moved closer, creating an informal half-circle of witnesses. Mrs. Washington had come outside and stood on her porch, arms folded, watching the scene unfold. Inside Mrs. Johnson's house, her neighbor Linda was helping her change into dry clothes while fighting back tears of anger. "Edith, we should get you to the hospital. Make sure you're okay." Mrs. Johnson shook her head gently as she buttoned a fresh blouse. "I'm not hurt, Linda. Just my pride a bit. And I've survived worse than wounded pride in my 78 years. She paused, looking at her reflection in the small mirror on her bedroom wall. "But I won't pretend it didn't happen, not this time." Outside, Chief Jackson had pulled out his phone. "Officer Wilder, I've received a video of your interaction with Mrs. Johnson." He turned the screen so Wilder could see the frozen image, his own arm extended, water pouring from his bottle onto the elderly woman's head. "Does this align with your description of offering some water?" The color drained from Wilder's face. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Sir, I can explain. The situation was—" "I've seen the entire video," Chief Jackson cut him off, voice still measured but carrying enough authority that several neighbors had inched closer to hear. "I saw Mrs. Johnson sitting on her own property. I saw you approach her. I heard her ask for your badge number and I saw your response." Each sentence landed like a hammer on nail. "What I didn't see was any justification for your actions." Wilder's professional mask began to crack. "With all due respect, sir, you weren't here for the whole interaction. She was being uncooperative and—" "Uncooperative?" The chief's voice finally rose slightly. "I've known Edith Johnson for 15 years. She volunteers at the community center every Tuesday helping kids with reading. She bakes cookies for the department's holiday drive." He stepped closer to Wilder. "But even if she were the most difficult person in this city, your actions would still be inexcusable." By now, a small crowd had gathered. Thomas had moved to a better position, still recording. He could see Officer Wilder's face changing as he realized how serious the situation had become. "Chief, I made a mistake," Wilder said, his voice dropping. "It's been a long shift and—" "Stop." Chief Jackson held up his hand. "This isn't about having a bad day, Officer Wilder. This is about abuse of power. This is about disrespect to a community elder. This is about behavior that destroys every bit of trust we've worked to build." He extended his hand, palm up. "Badge. And gun. Now." A murmur went through the watching neighbors. Wilder's eyes widened. "Sir, you can't. You're not. This is just a misunderstanding. I deserve a proper hearing, not some kind of public—" "You'll get a proper hearing," the chief assured him, hand still extended. "But right now you're being placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Badge and gun, officer." For a moment it seemed Wilder might refuse. His hand moved to his hip, fingers brushing his holster in what appeared to be an unconscious gesture. The atmosphere turned electric with tension. Chief Jackson didn't move. "Think very carefully about your next action, Officer Wilder." From the door of her house, now dressed in clean clothes with a colorful scarf covering her still damp hair, Mrs. Johnson stepped onto her porch. The sight of her seemed to break whatever resistance Wilder was building. His shoulders slumped. Slowly, mechanical in his movements, he unclipped his badge and removed his gun from its holster, placing both in the chief's outstretched hand. "Report to Internal Affairs tomorrow morning at 9, Chief Jackson said, pocketing the items. "Officer Reynolds will drive you back to the station now." He nodded toward the SUV where his driver had stepped out, watching the scene carefully. As Wilder was escorted to the SUV, Chief Jackson turned and walked toward Mrs. Johnson's house. The neighbors parted to let him through, many nodding in approval. Thomas lowered his phone, the video stopping as the chief reached Mrs. Johnson's steps. "Mrs. Johnson," the chief said, his formal tone softening. "On behalf of the Oak Ridge Police Department, I want to apologize for what happened today." Mrs. Johnson looked at him for a long moment, then at the neighbors gathered around, and finally, at Thomas standing across the street. "Thank you for coming yourself, Robert," she said, using the chief's first name with the familiarity of someone who had known him long before his title. "Would you like to come in for some iced tea? I believe we have some things to discuss about how your officers treat our neighborhood." Chief Jackson nodded. "Yes, ma'am, I believe we do." He gestured to the neighbors. "Perhaps a few community representatives would like to join us." As they moved inside, Thomas received a text from his cousin Daniel. Video reached the mayor's office. "This is going to make changes happen. Good work, cousin." Thomas looked up at Mrs. Johnson's house where the chief and several neighbors were now entering. Something important had just happened on Maple Street. Something that went beyond one cruel act and one immediate consequence. He had a feeling this story was far from over. By evening, the video of Officer Wilder pouring water on Mrs. Johnson had spread far beyond Maple Street. Thomas Lee's cousin Daniel had shared it with not only the mayor's office but also a trusted reporter at the local news station. By the 6 o'clock broadcast, the story led the evening news. Tonight we begin with disturbing footage showing an Oak Ridge police officer pouring water on an elderly resident, the anchor began, her expression serious. "We want to warn viewers that this video may be upsetting." In living rooms across the city, people watched as the incident played out on their screens. The station had blurred Mrs. Johnson's face out of respect, but her dignity as she sat drenched was clear even without seeing her expression. The video ended with Chief Jackson arriving and confronting Officer Wilder. In her small apartment across town, Officer Lisa Reynolds watched the broadcast with a mixture of anger and relief. She had been on the force for 5 years and had witnessed Wilder's behavior firsthand. The comments he made when supervisors weren't around, the way he treated people in certain neighborhoods differently, the complaints that somehow never stuck to him. "About time," she murmured, texting her partner Miguel. "Are you seeing this? Chief Jackson actually did something." At the station, things were chaotic. The Public Affairs Office was flooded with calls from reporters seeking statements. The police commissioner had called an emergency meeting with the department's leadership team. And in a small conference room, Chief Jackson sat with Mrs. Johnson, her nephew who was an attorney, and the city's director of community relations. "We're not looking to make a public spectacle, Chief," Mrs. Johnson said, hands folded neatly on the table. "But we are looking for real change." The chief nodded. "Mrs. Johnson, I want to be clear that Officer Wilder's actions today don't represent what this department stands for, but I also recognize that his behavior didn't happen in isolation." "No," she agreed. "It didn't. For years, certain officers have treated our neighborhood like they're an occupying force rather than public servants. Most just drive through, never getting to know the community. Others, like Officer Wilder, seem to enjoy flexing their authority." The community relations director, Paulo Reyes, had been taking notes. "Mrs. Johnson, would you be willing to help us establish a community advisory board? We've been trying to get one started, but it's been difficult finding long-time residents willing to participate." Because they don't trust that anything will actually change, Mrs. Johnson's nephew pointed out. Fair assessment, Chief Jackson acknowledged. So let's talk about concrete changes, not just committees. Back on Maple Street, neighbors had gathered at the community garden at the end of the block. Thomas was there with his mother and many others, including Mrs. Washington and Mr. Rivera. The mood was a mixture of anger, hope, and something that felt like cautious optimism. I've lived on this street for 30 years, Mr. Rivera said, leaning on his cane. Seen officers come and go, some good, some not so good. But I never thought I'd see one held accountable right before my eyes like that. It only happened because Thomas recorded it, his mother pointed out, putting a proud hand on her son's shoulder. And because Mrs. Washington knew who to call. Thomas shook his head. I just did what anyone would do. But that's just it, Mrs. Washington said, her teacher's voice making everyone listen. Not everyone would. Some people look away. Some are afraid of getting involved. Change happens when people like you don't look away, Thomas. The next morning, the story had gone national. Major news networks picked up the footage and social media buzzed with reactions. Hashtags trended, "Chamar Justice for Mrs. Johnson" and "Police Accountability." Comment sections filled with thousands of people sharing similar experiences or expressing outrage. At the Oak Ridge Police Department headquarters, Officer Wilder sat stiffly in a chair outside the Internal Affairs office. His union representative sat beside him, reviewing notes on a legal pad. Wilder had barely slept, the reality of his situation becoming clearer with each passing hour. They're going to make an example of me, he muttered. The union rep sighed. James, I've represented officers through all kinds of situations. Excessive force claims, procedural violations, you name it. But pouring water on an elderly woman? On camera? There's no gray area here, no procedural argument I can make. The best we can do is cooperate fully and hope for the least severe outcome. Inside the Internal Affairs office, investigators weren't just reviewing the water incident. They had pulled Wilder's complete personnel file, including past complaints that had been dismissed or buried. A pattern was emerging, and it wasn't flattering. Look at this, said Investigator Chen, pointing to a complaint from 2 years earlier. Excessive force complaint filed by a black teenage boy, dismissed because there were no witnesses. And this one from last year, aggressive language during a routine traffic stop. The driver had a dashboard camera, but mysteriously, Wilder's body camera malfunctioned. Her colleague nodded. And check the supervisors who signed off on these dismissals. 3 different names, but all part of former Deputy Chief Morris's team. The old guard, Chen said, making a note. Chief Jackson's been trying to clean house, but it's hard to fire supervisors without clear evidence of misconduct. Well, her colleague said, thanks to Officer Wilder's water bottle, we might finally have the thread that unravels the whole sweater. At the mayor's office, a press conference was being prepared. The mayor stood with Chief Jackson and Mrs. Johnson, who had agreed to make a brief statement. She wore a bright blue dress and held her head high as cameras flashed. I'm not here seeking vengeance, she said, her clear voice belying her 78 years. I'm here seeking change. What happened to me yesterday has happened in different ways to many people in our community. The difference is that this time there was a video, and this time there was immediate action. She looked at Chief Jackson. I believe the chief when he says he wants to build a police department that truly serves and respects all neighborhoods, and I plan to hold him to that promise. The mayor stepped forward. Today, I'm announcing the formation of a police oversight commission with real authority. This commission will include community members from every district in our city, and it will have the power to review complaints, recommend disciplinary action, and participate in police training development. As the press conference continued, Thomas watched from his living room with his family. His phone kept buzzing with messages from friends who'd recognized him in some of the news footage. His leadership project on community police relations had taken on a life of its own. You know, his father said quietly, what you did yesterday, that took courage. I'm proud of you. Thomas nodded, thinking about Mrs. Johnson's dignity and Chief Jackson's decisive action. I just hope it actually leads to real change, not just Talk. His mother squeezed his shoulder. Change has to start somewhere. Sometimes it starts with one person making one choice in one moment. On his phone, Thomas opened a message from his leadership program instructor. Your project just became a real-world case study. Would you be willing to speak to the whole program about what happened? He typed back. Yes, but only if Mrs. Johnson can join me. She's the one who showed real courage. 6 months passed, bringing autumn's cooler temperatures to Oak Ridge City. The large brick building at the corner of Maple Street and Central Avenue had undergone a remarkable transformation. Once a rundown community center that the city had nearly closed due to budget cuts, it now stood freshly painted, with new windows and a sign that read, The Edith Johnson Community Bridge. Inside, volunteers arranged chairs in neat rows, while others set up refreshments on tables decorated with fall flowers. The grand reopening ceremony was scheduled to begin in an hour, and already people were arriving early, eager to be part of the historic day. Thomas Lee, now in his senior year of high school, adjusted his tie as he checked the audio equipment. His leadership project had evolved into something much bigger than a school assignment. The video he'd taken had not only led to Officer Wilder's dismissal from the force, but had sparked a citywide conversation about police conduct and community relations. Now Thomas was preparing to introduce the speakers at today's ceremony. Nervous? Asked his father, helping to arrange programs on a table near the entrance. Thomas nodded. A little. I've never spoken in front of this many people before. Just speak from the heart, his father advised. That's what got you here in the first place. Across the room, Mrs. Johnson sat in a comfortable chair, greeting well-wishers who came to pay their respects. At 79, she had become something of a local celebrity, though she dismissed such notions with a wave of her hand. I'm just an old woman who didn't feel like being disrespected, she often said. But her actions in the months following the incident had proven her to be much more. After the initial press coverage died down, Mrs. Johnson had turned down offers for paid interviews and book deals. Instead, she had channeled the attention toward meaningful change. She'd accepted the mayor's invitation to co-chair the Police Oversight Commission, insisting that it include representatives from every neighborhood in the city. She'd attended community meetings, sometimes 2 or 3 in a week, listening to residents share their experiences with law enforcement. Mrs. Johnson, called a familiar voice. Chief Jackson approached, looking more relaxed than he had in months, though the responsibilities of his position still showed in the lines around his eyes. Everything looks wonderful. Robert, she greeted him warmly. Yes, the volunteers have worked so hard. I hardly recognize the old place. The chief nodded, looking around at the transformed space. It's fitting that this building will bear your name. A bridge between the police department and the community is exactly what we've been trying to build. The center had been renovated as a joint project between the police department and the neighborhood council. It would serve as both a senior center during weekdays and a meeting place for regular dialogues between police and residents. One room had been dedicated as a youth center, where officers would volunteer to tutor students and run sports programs. Have you heard anything about Officer Wilder? Mrs. Johnson asked quietly. Chief Jackson's expression turned serious. He's moved to another state. Tried to apply to 3 different departments, but our investigation findings followed him. No, agency is willing to take the risk. Mrs. Johnson nodded thoughtfully. I never wished him harm, just accountability. The accountability was long overdue, the chief replied. Not just for him, but for the supervisors who protected him. The department is healthier without them. The internal investigation had eventually led to the resignation of 2 sergeants and a lieutenant, who had systematically buried complaints against officers they favored. The old guard, as they were known, had maintained a culture that Chief Jackson had been fighting against since taking office. By noon, the community center was filled to capacity. Local news crews set up cameras at the back of the room. The mayor sat in the front row beside the city council members and the police commissioner. Residents from every neighborhood in Oak Ridge had come, some wearing t-shirts with slogans like Community Bridge and Respect and Protect. Thomas stepped up to the microphone, taking a deep breath before speaking. 6 months ago, I witnessed something from across the street that changed my life. I saw cruelty, but I also saw dignity. I saw abuse of power, but I also saw true leadership. What happened that day on Maple Street could have been just another story of injustice that fades from memory. Instead, it became a turning point for our city. As Thomas continued his introduction, Mrs. Johnson watched with pride. In the audience sat Thomas's entire leadership class, along with students from other schools who had started similar programs. Near the back, Officer Lisa Reynolds and several other officers stood in uniform, representing the new face of community policing in Oak Ridge. When it was Mrs. Johnson's turn to speak, the room fell silent. She walked slowly to the podium, her cane tapping gently on the wooden floor. "When I was a little girl," she began, "my grandmother told me something I never forgot. She said, 'Edith, sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best things we do.' On that hot day 6 months ago, having water poured on my head by someone who was supposed to protect me, that was a bad thing. But what came after? That's been something quite remarkable." She gestured around the room. "Look at us now. Police officers and neighbors talking together instead of at each other. Young people like Thomas learning that their voices matter. City officials listening instead of just talking. We've turned a moment of shame into a movement of change." As the ceremony continued, 3 new officers were introduced, all residents of Westside who had been inspired to join the police academy because of the changes they'd seen in the department. Chief Jackson announced expanded training programs, focused on de-escalation and community engagement. The mayor revealed plans to replicate the community bridge model in other neighborhoods. After the ribbons were cut and the official photos taken, the celebration continued into the afternoon. Children played in the new playground behind the building. Seniors gathered in the game room to teach officers how to play dominoes. Teenagers, including Thomas, showed Chief Jackson the plans for a mural they wanted to paint on the back wall, a depiction of neighbors and police working together to build a bridge. Mrs. Washington, now heading the senior programs at the center, found Mrs. Johnson sitting quietly by a window watching it all. "Penny for your thoughts, Edith?" Mrs. Johnson smiled. "I was just thinking about how quickly things can change. 6 months ago, I was sitting in that chair on my lawn just trying to catch a breeze. Now look at all this. Do you think it will last?" Mrs. Washington asked. "All these changes?" Mrs. Johnson considered the question, watching as Officer Reynolds helped a little boy build a tower of blocks. Nearby, Thomas was explaining the mural design to a group of interested residents. "Change is never finished," she said finally. "It's something you keep working at every day. But yes, I think some of it will last. Enough to matter. Enough to build on." She reached for her friend's hand. "And that's worth getting your head wet for, I suppose." The 2 women laughed, their voices joining the happy sounds that filled the center. A true bridge built from an unlikely moment, proving that sometimes transformation begins with a single act of courage, whether it's pouring water or recording a video or simply refusing to accept that some things can't change.